Welcome to The Cynical Developer, the podcast that helps you to improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology and providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer. This episode is sponsored by the PVS Studio team, who promote static code analysis methodology in general and its PVS Studio tools in particular. Static code analyzers allow you to find bugs in source code in the development stages. This helps to reduce the costs of fixing them. PVS Studio performs code analysis and issues warnings on the fragments of code with a high probability of having bugs and potential vulnerabilities in them. The tools support C, C++, C# and Java, and it can work with Visual C++, GCC, Clang compilers and some of those for embedded systems. The analyzers work on Windows, Linux and Mac OS as a standalone tool and integrated into Visual Studio, IntelliJ IDE and SonarQube. In the show notes you will find links to the PVS Studio website and the article Technologies Used in the PVS Studio Code Analyzer for Finding Bugs and Potential Vulnerabilities. Now go check it out. In this episode we talked to Iris Classon about distributed monoliths and why they could be or could not be a better solution for you. Iris is a Microsoft MVP, author, speaker, a former clinical dietitian and personal trainer. She's also now on the board of the .NET Foundation and a mother to 4-year-old Loke. So welcome to The Cynical Developer.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule and away from your family to record this.
Yeah, let's get this done while the baby sleeps.
yeah, definitely. I know how that is. And it is very, very difficult to find time for these sort of things as the kids get a bit older.
It's still easy at 4 months. It's easier than it's going to be later on. You know that.
Oh yeah, especially when they're banging on the door and they want to come in and see what you're doing. I've come into the office several times and they've destroyed my mic setup. They've pulled the windsock off and it's all unplugged and I can't find leads. And yeah, it's a challenge. It keeps you on your toes.
Definitely.
But I think it was announced on date of recording, I think it was today, maybe yesterday, that you have joined the board for the .NET Foundation, so congratulations for that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually really surprised because I didn't think I'd actually make the board. I thought, why not? Let's give this a go. But I didn't expect to get a lot of votes, so I'm pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, well, if you don't try, you don't know, do you? So it is pretty
exactly.
awesome.
I wanted more people to run as candidates, and I thought if I don't do it myself, it's sort of hard to encourage people to do things if you don't do it yourself. So okay, lead by example. I'm going to do this. I even recorded the video how you sign up as a voting member and everything. And then I didn't think much more about it until I saw people writing on Twitter that I was elected, and I was like, holy shit.
All right. Other people found out before you did.
Yeah, pretty much.
Awesome. And I think it's as a .NET developer, I can see that it's a very, very exciting time for the .NET community, and it's great. And I think looking at a few of the other people that are on the board, I had the privilege to meet some of them earlier this year at NDC London, so that was really good. And maybe in the future I'll get to interview some of them and get them on the show.
Oh, I can imagine. I would love that. Try definitely to get John Skeet on. And you know what you should talk about? You should talk about the European Union. Sorry about that. Couldn't help myself. And also, they just voted through that they were basically saying that countries in the European Union can choose themselves if they want to have daylight savings or seasonal time change. And they get to decide themselves what time they want to keep. So this basically means bye-bye to time zones and a lot of problems. And Skeet is expert on time. He has this fantastic library, Know.Time, which is really good. And he had quite a good discussion with him about time, mostly him answering my questions. So if you can get a hold of him and ask him about time, that would be an awesome podcast.
Yeah. You went a different way to what I thought you were going to talk about. Then I thought you were going to say we should get him on and talk about strikingly obscene trousers.
Oh yeah, you can talk about that too. I love his pants. His pants are awesome.
Yeah, yeah. I was actually discussing Node at Time this week with the people at the company I currently work for, because we've done a lot with time zones, and then the news came out about getting rid of daylight savings and things like that. I was like, great, this is going to be fantastic. But luckily, because of how the system is built that we've currently got, it doesn't really affect it too much. So we're in a very lucky situation, I think, with that product.
I'm tempted to ask more about that, but then we'll end up with 1 hour podcast talking about time.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And because I'm a contractor, it also, I don't know how much I'm allowed to disclose, if anything at all.
That's true.
Yeah.
Well, at least we can summarize and say that the European Union has made it very fun for us as developers, not only with now with this and now Article 11 and 13, and not to mention the GDPR and all that fun. So
yeah, the GDPR is a very hot topic, and I like the fact that the Americans were all laughing at us, and they're going to be getting something very similar introduced as well. So they'll be laughing the other side of their faces soon enough.
Yeah. But you know what's the most insane part? That a lot of systems decided that the way they were going to solve the GDPR law enforcement part of it is basically just block countries from outside the US, or at least countries from the European Union. I think Washington Post still does that, and a few others, which is what?
Yeah. There was a website I used to use, and I can't think what it is. And after GDPR came in, I went to it, and it went, no. You're not in the US. You can't use this service anymore. I was like, that's just a get out of jail free card. That really.
Yeah, but Britain does this, because I lived in UK.
Sure.
And I noticed that some sites you can't go to because they're basically blocked, and
right.
I find that really fascinating. Obviously, some adult content. Not that I'll be looking for it, but I just.
Well, you've admitted it now. It's out there.
Yeah. Is there like a law against spanking in the UK? Never mind. I'm not going to change the topic, but blocking sites can be done at different levels. And I sort of assumed that a country such as, for example, in Britain, that they wouldn't do it. But there are quite a few pirating sites, mostly. That's how I discovered it. I'm not saying I'm using them, but
sure.
If I wanted to, I couldn't.
Yeah, something that may rhyme with pirate hay and places like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's I've seen that, and that it's down to certain ISPs block certain content, and whether you're on a mobile device or if you're on your own network at home, depends on what content gets blocked and what doesn't.
Yeah. And if you, when you sign up for broadband, you have to explicitly ask them to unblock adult content. And by adult content, I don't mean just porn. I mean other adult content as well, which I found a bit weird, because you got to be over 18 to sign up for broadband anyway. So
it is bizarre. And
so when you call in, it's sort of like, hey, so I want to watch porn. Can you help me with that? It's just really awkward conversation.
Yeah. I know you get it with the mobile phone providers, and you think, well, this mobile phone is set up on a contract, and you have to be 18 to have a contract. You've already got my credit card details, because they say you need to provide credit card details to prove that you're over 18. Just like, yeah. I think a lot of these systems are very flawed. They were rushed into, because on the face of it, GDPR is fantastic. I think it's really good. It's just really badly implemented, and it could be done in such a better way. Yeah,
I agree.
But we're not here today to talk about international law and spanking and
we're talking about
internet
the
concepts. Oh yeah. They were that became a sideline from the .NET Foundation. It's a great thing. It's a fantastic thing that the foundation is moving in the way that it is, and especially with .NET Core. I think .NET has got a very bright future coming along now.
Yes.
But the main topic we are here to talk about is distributed monoliths.
Yes.
Which it sounds like another crazy term, Web 2.0. Let's go with distributed monoliths. We all have heard of monoliths. Where the best buzzword at the moment is microservice architecture. So this is going to be an interesting new one for myself and maybe a lot of the listeners out there. So we'll start off at the very top for those that don't understand what the term monolith means. Are you able to explain that for us?
Just a monolith?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, the word itself it refers either to like a large piece of stone, like a monument or something. But the second most used, or I guess the second description of the word monolith is basically a system that is indivisible and slow to change. So a monolith is a large system. It could be like a free tire system, but it's still one big piece, and it has to be deployed as one, and it does all the end-to-end operations. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. I mean, the positive sides with the monolith is you have everything in one place, and it's easier to sort of just, release updates and so on if it's fairly small. But it's when the monolith starts growing and becomes this monster that's difficult to test, difficult to expand, and you can't pick out modules, and every time you need to add something, you have to add to the actual monolith, and you have this single point of failure. That's when it becomes a problem. So a monolith today is often considered like a bad word. People talk about monolith like the same way they talk about legacy code, but we all know that legacy code doesn't necessarily have to be bad. So the same thing goes for a monolithic architecture.
Sure. Yeah, it's I think for me, in a lot of the businesses I've worked with, a monolith is it tends to be what gets built, because it's a lot easier for people to build. It's a lot easier for people to get their head around how it works, and it just used to be the way to build software.
Yeah, but because first you had like the one tire monolith, so the first systems weren't that complex and it wasn't layered, and then it was introduced the typical entire pre-tire systems, still monoliths, but at least you had sort of some division of responsibility within that monolith, and people felt quite okay with that. And monoliths are cool in that way that it's easy to get started. You don't have to set up, a big deployment pipeline and manage a lot of different aspects that you need to manage with a more distributed system. But nonetheless, it can grow into this monster, and that's why it's gotten a really bad rep.
Yeah, it has. And I've worked with some awful monoliths in the past. I've written some awful monoliths in the past, but I've also worked with some good ones as well. So as you say, it's not always bad. There are good points to it, but we mentioned there we're going to talk about distributed monoliths. So what is a distributed monolith?
Well, so I don't think that there's nothing it's not an official term, distributed monolith. So it's not like with SOA, I think it's like a group of people got together, decided this is SOA, and we'll probably talk about that later. But distributed monolith, I don't even know who coined that term. It's just, it's a way to describe, for me, it's a way to describe when you've tried to implement a microservice architecture, but it's not actually a microservice architecture. You're basically just taking a monolith and you deploy it as a bunch of different services, but they're all connected, and you still have one point of failure, because if one goes down, all of them goes down, and they all go towards the same data store and everything. So it's basically one big system, but you can deploy them onto different machines. You don't have to deploy them as one, and maybe if you're lucky, you're even able to scale some of them independently of each other, but you still have to deploy them as one.
Sure. Yeah. It seems like it's very similar to what we, as you actually already mentioned, which was SOA, which was service orientated architecture. Is it the same as that, or is it different? And if it is, can you explain why it's different?
Well, so SOA, it's a very vague term, though. It's let me just think about it. It's a little bit similar, but the difference is with SOA, you have somewhat clearly scoped services, and they are self-contained. But with the distributed monolith, they're not necessarily clearly scoped, and they're not scoped to so level. So it's sort of also a level of how much you've scoped them. Microservices are like even smaller scoped pieces than service-oriented architecture. Oh, this is starting to get really confusing. I don't feel like I'm explaining this too well. But like I say, a distributed monolith is a little bit more of an accident. It's sort of a halfway point towards going towards service-oriented architecture, maybe towards microservice architecture, but you haven't managed to scope your services very well, and they are still very heavily reliant upon each other and still goes towards the same data source, and you have a lot of shared assemblies in between and so on. So it's not like you can deploy them separately, and that's a big difference for me, that you cannot deploy separately.
Sure. Yeah, I think
or update separately. So you're still deploying everything as if it was a monolith, only you deploy it to different servers.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's very similar to what I've been told by developers in the past that they believe microservices to be, and until you sort of explain to them, no, micro means small.
Yes.
So single use cases on each of these services, and it actually describes to a point one of the systems that I'm working with for one of my clients at the moment. So it's definitely something that is out there, and we have had that discussion about the dependencies on each of the other services, because without any of the other services that in the group, in the distributed monolith, it all falls down. There's sorry about that. I haven't turned my my phone off, and the predator went off in the background. I don't know if it picked that up, but yeah. So yeah, it's using a single data source in the back end, and that there was almost talk of ending up back in DLL hell that we used to be in, with shared libraries between the different services that were available.
Yeah.
So if you are going to build one of these systems, does it have to be a RESTful service now? And the reason that I say that is because we mentioned SOA, and coming from the .NET world, when any of you talk about service-orientated architecture with any .NET developers, they straight away, in my experience anyway, jump to the idea of using SOAP, and it's always the first thing they say. No, we're not going to go down that way because I'm not using SOAP. It's not what I want to do. I don't want to use XML. I want to be using JSON. So is it just RESTful? Can it be any communication technology? What's the setup that you're using, for example?
Well, restfulness has nothing to do with it, really, although it's considered a good practice. So, I mean, REST is, I guess, it's not the latest craze. It's been around for a while, but I think people have generally agreed that for most APIs, using REST makes sense. For most of them, it doesn't have to. We can have a longer discussion about when you could consider alternatives. But it doesn't really affect how you architecture your system. I mean, you can have a distributed monolith that's RESTful, but you still have a distributed monolith. So the other way around. Yeah, sure.
So we briefly mentioned microservices as well, and the way that you came to distributed monoliths, I believe, is through one of your recent projects. Why did you feel that going full microservice was not the right move for you?
Well, it was what we were attempting to do. So I'm working for a company, Construct. It's a startup in Gothenburg, and it's basically enterprise planning, usually budgeting, prognosis, but any data-driven, numeric data-driven type of planning for large enterprises. That's what we do. And it started out with an idea and one developer who started working on the main system, and that service was called main. Right. And then they added this admin section to the system, so the service admin was added. And then we do a lot of calculations, so they created a calculation engine service.
Yep.
And then we had to aggregate data. So we created an aggregation engine service. And that's sort of how it developed. So I think the idea was that this is going to turn into microservice architecture, but it wasn't. I mean, it sort of just organically grew to become these different services. But when you looked at them, they all had the same, going towards the same data store. They were using the same shared assemblies. They were reliant upon each other back and forward.
Yep.
And they were basically very heavily intertwined. And often when we had to add a new features, like, oh, where am I going to put this feature? Add it to main. So
Yep.
main sort of became the dumpster when you didn't know where to put things, because, oh, I can't be bothered. Do I have to create a service just for this? And that's how it ended up becoming a distributed monolith. But the reason why they started dividing it into different services, or creating new services when they expanded the functionality of the system, was to be able to deploy into different environments, so we could have scale, so we could be able to scale both vertically and horizontally. So I guess that part was accomplished, but we didn't really accomplish the microservice architecture. And now we're going towards that, but it's quite hard to break out the system into microservices. It's a very long and slow process, and it might not necessarily be worth it depending on what type of system you have and what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, it rings pretty true that it was an organic thing. I know that one of my very first development jobs, we built a system that wasn't a million miles from what you described. It didn't do service communication between different platforms, but we had an admin system, and we had maybe, I think it was 4 or 5 websites that all ran off this same core code. So we called it core, similar to as you called it main, where everything went, all the logic went, because you think, oh, well, I'll just put this in because we need it on website 1, and then it might be just by chance that you need it on website 2. So it was good to have it in there, and it made development of it a little bit easier. And it did become a massive code base, and the word core has followed me ever since. So for the last 15 plus years, whenever I build anything, my business layer often gets called core. But now there's .NET Core, I can't call it that anymore.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about core, because there is this popular concept called the onion architecture, which, among other things, talks about you have the core, and then you have the entities, and then you have infrastructure, and so on, where you sort of layer your application like an onion, hence the term. I'll need another hour to distinguish between an onion architecture and an entire architecture. It's layered, but it's not layered.
Yeah. I almost asked that question then, and I thought maybe I shouldn't. and then you said, yeah, there's another hour in that. Maybe there's another show in that. The differences between an onion and between entity.
The thing is that I always have this fear, like, oh my God, what if I'm explaining something wrong, or what if I've misunderstood it myself? But the truth is that there are very few things that have a set definition. People will disagree on forever what REST is, for example, even though there is a paper you could read that explains everything. But people are still disagreeing on an implementation of REST, or what it even means. People will discuss forever service-oriented architecture, even though that was fairly well defined when the term was coined. So it's very hard to explain terms in software development, because usually when people explain, there are a lot of opinions tied to it. Yeah. We love opinions as software developers.
Sure. If there's something to argue about, then we're all over it. And I think if we ever get to that nirvana where there isn't, I'm sure the developers will be arguing over the colour of grass outside, just to keep that going. Because every time there's anything out there, there's chance for an opinion on the topic.
Yeah.
So with following this way, I mentioned there about one of my previous projects where we had this core logic, and that was shared with between all these different front ends. Are you not now in that same world of shared logic and DLL hell from implementing it this way?
Well, it depends on what you mean by DLL hell. It's not a classic DLL hell, because we deploy everything as one big massive unit, but it just goes on to different machines, and then at different scale and scale sets. But it's still deployed as one. Right. So we don't have DLL hell in that way. Sure. But our problem is now when we want to be able to update the services independently of each other, that's when we're going to have problems with versioning, for example. We also do continuous integration and delivery, and that is a challenge when you want to, for example, use a NuGet server and you want to deploy certain packages to the server, and you can end up with different versions. Then you need to manage the versions. So we're going to end up having DLL hell that way instead.
Yes. Yeah, that's the hell that I refer to now with libraries. I think you mentioned there that you circumnavigate it a little bit by always deploying everything.
Yes.
But you can probably guarantee that one of the managers at one point is going to come and say, "Oh, there's this problem here. Can we just deploy that one piece?" And it's like, no, because we've upgraded everything, and if we put it out there, we need to put everything out. And they're like, no, just go with that. And somehow you get that one piece out there, but then you need some sort of way to work out what versions of what libraries are used where, and then you end up with a horrible Excel spreadsheet managed by a program manager or somebody out there, and it gets very, very depressing very quickly.
Yeah, not to mention how you manage semantic versioning with something that isn't semantic, such as continuous integration and delivery, because that's something we need to solve. So the thing with the DLL hell, and right now deploying everything as one to avoid DLL hell, basically is what the distinction for me is between a distributed monolith and a true microservice architecture. Microservices are completely self-contained. You will still probably have assemblies that are going to be used across microservices, but you'll need to manage that with tying them to different versions and so on. But you should be able to deploy services independently.
Yeah, and I think one of the big things there is that in this distributed monolith is that if one of these services goes down, you say everything goes down, whereas in a microservice, if a service goes down, the services that rely on it should maybe have a cached version of the data that it can rely on, or it fails in a way that's elegantly, so it goes and sits on a queue until it gets processed, which you're not getting at with this approach.
Yeah, right now, I mean, not the whole system isn't going to blow up, but we are actually a bit uncertain of what the consequences for the other services will be if one goes down. And this is basically the same thing as everything going down. It's still a single point of failure if you don't have the guarantee that everything is going to work, even though one of the services goes down.
Yeah. It sounds like a very exciting project to run Chaos Monkey on. Just to see what happens.
I mean, but our system is a perfect example of how these things happen, because when you start building a system, it makes sense to start building a monolithic system, because you gotta sort of get a feeling for the domain before you start. If you start breaking out things too early, you might not get the right scopes, and then you have to redo it and everything. And you see a lot of really bad microservice architectures where people are too eager too early on. So you start off with a monolithic architecture, and then when you sort of know what your different boundaries are, that's when you can start breaking things out into microservices. The challenge is to do it at the right time and not to do it when the system becomes too big. And also, being a startup, we have limited resources, both human and financial, and very rarely something like rewriting the whole system becomes a priority.
Yeah, that's very, very true, and I think it's a good approach as well for people that are looking at legacy projects, that you often get given some of these behemoth, these massive monolith projects that have maybe been being built for 10 plus years, and people say, right, go and build that in the latest technology, and we want it to be microservices, and we want it to be this, and we want it to be that. But when you go and look at the code, there is no clear borders between any section of the project, so it's very, very hard then to break it up into microservices.
Yes.
And I think this approach helps you there because it lets those borders bleed into each other, and you have that shared code and those shared borders, if you like.
This is for us. This is the first step towards
Yes.
towards what we want to achieve, and this is still manageable for us because when you have microservices, they're quite small, so you have a lot of them, and those are a lot of moving pieces. And it's not just the pieces themselves managing them; it's also managing the full pipeline. So the integration part and the testing part and the delivery part.
Yep.
So it's a lot to manage, and you have to have a plan for that as well. And I strongly recommend that you figure out what the plan is before you start coding. The way we've started going more towards a true microservice architecture is now we're migrating some of our services to ASP.NET Core, which sort of fits very well with the whole microservice architecture ideology. So what we do is we're finding pieces we're finding scopes that are manageable but quite small that we can migrate to ASP.NET Core, and we set up the pipeline and everything like that. We still haven't set up our NuGet server and started taking the shared assemblies and deploying them there as packages instead. We're going to do that, so that's our next step. So now we're basically breaking up our distributed monolith into smaller pieces that eventually are going to be completely independent of each other, but we're not quite there yet.
Sure. So we mentioned that the negative points are that if one piece of the of this large Lego puzzle falls out, everything could fall down. There is some chance of problems with library dependencies. Make sure you have the same versions. Are there any other negative implications of developing and maintaining a project in this way?
Yeah, just the sheer size of it. So we have everything in one repository, and when you do the first clone, you might as well just go out for a lunch hour, so it's the size of the repository. It's nice to have everything in one place, but we use Visual Studio. When you open the solution file in Visual Studio, it's not responding for like half an hour. So just managing the sheer size of the system and having to pull everything down in one go because you can't select just parts of a repository, that's quite a pain. And that's one thing we really would like to avoid.
Yeah, that doesn't sound too good.
It also makes our builds quite slow and running through the tests because we deploy everything as one. Our deployment pipeline is super slow because we have a lot of tests, which is good. We got good code coverage. Unfortunately, it takes forever to run all the tests, even with quite a few agents on different machines and so on. There are a lot of tests, and we have to run all of them every single time we do a commit or we group some commits, but it's just the size is a problem. Yeah.
I've had projects that have taken 45 minutes at a time to build on my local machine, and Visual Studio is never your friend when you want to open a large project like that, and especially if you've got something like ReSharper installed as well, then good luck to you. You want to open it and come back sometime, probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and it may have opened it by then.
Visual Studio has this feature where it can run tests for you whenever it detects that the code has changed. But we tried using that, but it just said, nope, too many tests.
Well, that's not a bad thing, though. That's not a bad thing. I think this is probably the first time I've ever spoken to anybody that says we have too many tests.
We still don't have enough, but we have quite a few. I think one thing also with having everything in one place, unfortunately, it makes it a little bit too easy to, I'm just going to add a little change here and a little change here. And then you start, pushing through commits where you've done several things. So you're not just working on one issue. You do some refactoring, you fix on an issue, you add a new feature, and it all sort of ends up in the same commit, and it just becomes a mess. And it's too easy to change in the shared assemblies when it's there open, staring you right back in the face. But if everything was, if not everything, but it's at least we had a couple of separate repositories, it would make people think through a little bit more. Say that I want to change something in an assembly that gets packaged as a NuGet package, and then that is a dependency, that other services have. I will have to go and change there first, write the tests, because I don't have any other ways. I can't just run the service and go through the different steps and make sure it hits the assembly. So I'll have to write the tests, and I have to push it through the pipeline. And when all that is done, then I can go and update the version for the other services and run the tests and so on. It's a little bit more tedious process, but it makes you think through what you're doing and also test them a little bit better.
Yeah, I like the idea of even to the point where you were doing N-tier projects in the past, is that you would put your different layers into different repositories, make them libraries through a NuGet feed or something like that, because it makes you treat each of those different dependencies as third-party dependencies. So you would say, oh, I need to do this. So what I need to do is actually go and do that bit of code in the other library, get the other project up, you build it. I think it puts you in a different mindset to sit there and think, right, I'm going to build this and I know how I need it, but because I'm building it in here on its own, I'm probably going to be a little bit more generic in what I'm doing so that other applications can use it. And I think it gives you more of a chance to be a better developer, for want of a better word. So we've been quite negative about the approach that you've taken so far. So let's turn it up a bit. I know it's the cynical developer, and I'm here to be very negative and cynical about these things. But what are some of the positive implications of developing a system like this? Are there any?
There are. So one is obviously it's nice to be able to split the system up and deploy it onto different machines. You come to a point where you need to scale out, not just vertically, but also horizontally, and that needs to be able to, if you can. And another part is, at least it gets the developers to start thinking about scopes a little bit more. Because at least you're scoping it to different services. So you're starting to get into the right mindset, even though you're not quite there. So I would say those are the two positive aspects of it.
Sure. Yeah, that's it's good things, and I think
a third. Sorry to interrupt you.
Go.
The third one is when you start splitting things out into services. And this is regardless of what your final goal is. If it's a distributed monolith, I don't know why you would do that. Or if it's a service-oriented architecture or a microservice. When you start breaking things out, you start to get a better picture of the dependencies and your dependency graph. I think it's quite rare that developers actually look at dependency graph and realize how intertwined services are with each other and also with the shared assemblies. So I think that it helps. It really makes you think through a little bit more, and hopefully that makes you make wiser decisions in the future. So when you have something, and instead of go like, oh, I'll just chuck it in main, or oh, you have to be an admin to do that, so that's like admin service. Maybe somebody says, well, this manages accounts. Maybe it's about time that we have an account service that just manages, users' accounts or something like that. That's just just an example.
Yeah. So with all your experiences so far of ending up in the world of distributed monoliths, is this a route that you would advise people to definitely go with? Should they do that as a step change towards microservices? Should they do it as that's just what they're aiming for and be happy with that?
I don't have a yes or no answer to that. My answer to that would be aim to have self-contained services. But if you, let me start over. Okay. If you have a monolithic system and you want to make a change, first of all, do you have to change? Don't do it just because it's cool and the other kids are doing it, Not every single monolithic system has to be broken out into tiny pieces, because there's going to be a new trend in 5 years, and who knows, maybe that's going to be better. So, but if you've decided you want to break things out, aim to have them self-contained, because that's going to make everything much easier for you in terms of managing, in particularly managing the deployment pipeline. So you want to have self-contained services. If you can't do that and you still want to break out a monolith, that's when you're going to end up with a distributed monolith. So it's more of an ending up more than having it as a goal. I wouldn't make it a main goal, only for that reason, because the reason being is it's easy to trick oneself to believe that you have self-contained services, and you start treating them like they are, but they're not. And then you end up with an ugly surprise when you have this single point of failure, but it doesn't look like it.
Yeah. Yeah, you get that sudden realization that your beautiful baby is a lot uglier than you thought it was.
Yeah, I mean, you don't test as thoroughly as you would, and it's just other things,
Yeah. So you said that due to money and time and resource constraints, this was where you ended up, or the way that you went. If you had the resources and the time, would you have still gone this way, or would you have sat down and spent more time with the project and broken it out into a more, and traditional isn't quite the right word, but a microservice orientated structure?
Microservices, yes, because it's fun. Because it's fun, and I would love to work with true microservices. Just so I can say that I've done it. I've been on so many projects where we thought we had microservices, and then disappointment, it's not. Yeah. The truth is, it's really hard to implement a true microservice architecture, and when you look at the companies that do it, these are like big companies. Like when people talk about Spotify with their 300 plus services and all that, I mean, we don't have a system that is that size. So in the beginning, it wasn't worth it. It wouldn't have been worth it in the beginning. Now we're starting to get to a stage where it makes sense to do it. So even if I had all the time and the money in the world, when I started working at Construct, I wouldn't have chosen a microservice architecture, because it wouldn't have given us anything, because we didn't have the size or the complexity that needed to be dealt in such a way.
Sure, yeah. And a bit of resume-driven development is always nice. It's always good to put something else on the LinkedIn profile. I can now do this.
Yeah, I did a conference-driven development. I go to a conference and I come back. I spoke at the Docker conference. I came back to work like, everything's going to be a container. We're going to put everything in a container. I want to be in a container. Yeah. They stopped me.
It is very easy to get pulled into that world of implementing everything and all the nice and new shiny things. One of my friends, he used to be a .NET developer. He's now a JavaScript developer, and he's developing microservices in JavaScript. I apologize for all those people who I just made feel a bit sick. But we were having a discussion about microservices, and he actually changed my opinion on microservices as well, because what I thought they were different again to how he's doing it, and they are down to the nth degree of how minute his services are. What we would probably write as functions within a single service, they're broken down into services themselves. So if anybody has seen I think it's the Uber image that's out there for microservices, he's not working for them, but I would imagine that their dependency graph looks something like the misty cloud that's there for Uber, with the amount of millions of services they have.
Or like node modules and their dependencies.
Yes. Yeah, it's that's been a bit of a pain point for me of late. Something I've been giving the front end developers a hard time about is npm dependencies, but that's a whole different kettle of fish, I think, to to tackle at some other point.
Yeah, and it also makes me think like when you have like tiny little services, then you're going to have big fun at trying to implement transactions. So because
we don't need transactions.
So our system-based people do prognosis budgeting and so on, and we have a lot of people working on the same spreadsheets and so on.
Sure.
And we do quite heavy calculations and so on. There's always going to be lag, and performance is important and all that. So we have several problems that we need to sort out before we have microservices. And if we break them into very, very small services, we still need to manage, for example, transactions. We still need to make sure that communication is going to be really fast. So we'll need to use a message bus of sorts, because obviously we can't just go over HTTP because performance is going to be hell.
Yep.
We'll have to chain calls and quite a few things. So it's not as straightforward, and it can take a lot of time. So yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's something that people fail to understand, is that microservices may be more resilient, but they are not faster for your communication. I think doing the same thing over a monolith would be magnitudes faster than a microservice version of it. So it's a trade-off, and with many things in our industries, I guess it's whether you go monolith, whether you go distributed monolith, or whether you go microservices. It's a case of it depends.
Yeah, exactly, and also onboarding new team members. Like, hey, welcome. Here's like 200 services. Have fun, you know.
Yeah. It's
easier to give them like, here's a massive solution. This is going to look like code vomit and spaghetti, but this is all there is, and this is all you have to manage. It's for some people that might seem more familiar and more manageable than being given, you know, here are 200 repositories. Go have fun.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. It's. I think development is getting so much harder for people to come into. I've done a show where we talked about how front end development was getting harder, because I remember when all you needed JavaScript for was a bit of validation, maybe some funky animation, and that was it. And you needed CSS and a bit of HTML experience, and that was your front end done. It was on the back end, and now that's so complicated. But now with all these different approaches to how are you going to do the back end, which cloud formation are you going to use, it's becoming so complicated. I think we're going to get to the point where people's roles are going to become so specific. But
that's the thing. People still claim that there is something called a full stack developer, and you know, this is a discussion we can have another time, but I do not believe in full stack developers as in full stack, as in DevOps, front end, back end, you know, everything. I just can't see somebody doing a really good job at every single aspect of software development with the complexity we have today.
Yep.
It's just, you know, understanding everything from threading to a deployment pipeline to node module dependencies to gulp, pulp, rope. I don't know what they're called anymore. If it's Angular 1, 2, 3, 4, 15 or 60, or if you know, React all the things, or I don't know. There are so many things to know, and how are we supposed to know everything?
Yeah. It's I always put myself out as a full stack developer until very recently, and I've had to hold my hands up and say, look, it really depends on what stack you're using. I can be full stack for you if you use this stack, but I'm not full stack all the stacks, and that stack may stop at a certain point. So yes, it is very, very hard. I have a friend that he was in the same boat where he didn't believe in full stack developers. He then did some work with myself and then believed that I was full stack, but I was only full stack for what we were doing. I just happened to understand some of the business process as well as the back end, the database, the design side of it, and that's what he considered to be back end, because I was a graphic designer in a previous life as well. So a bit of a rare talent for a developer that can actually draw pretty pictures as well.
Yeah, don't count me in on that. But you're a girl. Oh, never mind.
No, that definitely is another topic.
Yep, let's leave that one out.
Yep, definitely. Anyway, I know that your family is needing you there in the background, so it's been great having you on to talk about this new buzzword, distributed monoliths. I think we need to get that quite viral as a hashtag, and we are going to claim that you came up with it.
Oh God, no, it's been around for a while. I don't hear a lot of people using it, so I hope I'm using it the right way, if there is such a thing. But it's not. I didn't make it.
It's definitely a term that's now made its way into my lexicon, because it describes so many systems that I work on, and I've always called them monoliths, but not quite. And this is the term I think I've been looking for. So that's good.
So distributed monolith is the broken dream of microservices.
I think there's a book in that. It's going to have to have violins as the opening sequence and stuff, but yeah, there's definitely something to that. But anyway, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule today for me.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and I shall let you get back to your family. And to everybody out there, thank you for listening to The Cynical Developer. I'm James Stoddart, and you've been listening to Iris Classon talking about distributed monoliths. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website, where you can find all the resource links, show notes for each episode. And if you enjoy this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever it is, and help The Cynical Developer to reach more developers around the globe.